Welcome back to Inside Story on Al Jazeera America. I'm Ray Suarez. On our program tonight, what to do about Syria as the civil war there enters its 5th year. Over the weekend, Secretary of State John Kerry appeared to open the door to negotiating directly with Syrian President Assad. Here's what he said on CBS Face the Nation.
And I am convinced that with the efforts of our allies and others, there will be increased pressure on Assad.
And you'd be willing to negotiate with him?
Well, we have to negotiate.
The State Department pulled back later, saying that Washington would never negotiate with Assad. Turkey, a NATO ally, is angry that the new international coalition striking ISIL in Syria and Iraq has lowered the priority for bringing down the Assad regime. Iranian forces and Iranian-allied Iraqi fighting men are prominent in the fight against ISIL in Iraq, as Iran remains at odds with the United States over, well, just about everything, and Iran is pulling for Assad to hang on in Syria. American partners in the fight against ISIL include Sunni monarchies that detest Iran and want to push back the Shia giant's power play across the Middle East. So, under relationship status, fill in, it's complicated. We're continuing our look at the Syrian conflict with Emad Kiyaei, Executive Director of the American Iranian Council and a researcher at Princeton, where he works with former senior Iranian diplomat Sayed Hossein Mousavian. He serves as Iranian representative at the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and Mohammed Ghanem, Director of Government Relations for the Syrian American Council. Welcome to you both. Mohammed, let me start with you. Are all the forces, all the different countries now involved in Syria and Iraq, fighting the same war, or are they fighting multiple wars just in tandem on the same piece of land?
I think Syria is quite different than Iraq. First of all, thanks so much for having me, Ray. It's a pleasure to see you again. I think they're fighting different wars. IHS Janes, a very well-reputed research center based in the UK, would tell you that only 6% of Assad's so-called counter-terror operations have targeted ISIS, and only 13% of ISIS attacks have targeted Assad. Most of their attacks are targeting the Syrian opposition. As you know, and as you rightly pointed out, the Iranian militias, Iranian IGRC, Qasem Soleimani, who was recently spotted along the borders with Jordan, are working hand in glove with the Assad regime. Their troops are on the ground, aiding and abetting the Assad regime in their crimes, and their war crimes and crimes against humanity. So in Syria, Iran is fighting alongside the Assad regime, and the Assad regime is fighting along against its citizenry.
Emad Kiyaei, how would you answer that same question? Are we looking at one regional war, or is it multiple wars just being fought in tandem?
Well, Ray, the conflict that is raging in the Middle East is multi-layered. I mean, there's not just about the influence of regional powers. We also have the international community in world powers dealing with their own sort of ideologies and interests in the Middle East. Now, what has happened, unfortunately, in the Syrian conflict, it has spilled over to neighboring countries, maybe by humanitarian crisis or by the rise of ISIS or Daesh. When we're talking about the multiple battlefields or battle theaters that these countries are fighting and these groups are fighting, yes, they involve the Assad government fighting its opposition. At the same time, you have a multitude of other more pressing rise of Daesh that has gone cross-border, that has now basically sidelined the issue and the importance of the Syrian conflict within the country, and has become more of a regional sort of pressing issue for the United States and allied forces, and ironically with the Iranians on the same page fighting against ISIS. So it's become way more complex than it was at the beginning of this crisis in Syria in 2011.
How important is Iran in helping the Assad regime keep its grip on whatever small part of Syria where it remains in control?
There's absolutely no question that the Iranians have been providing a great deal of assistance to the Assad government. And of course, this goes back for multiple reasons. One, the historical ties between Syria and Iran, where they have seen each other as an ally, a regional ally. They have a defense sort of agreement between the two countries. There's been deep-rooted economic and cultural sort of trade between the two countries. And finally, it is in the national interest of Iran to remain, to have Assad in power as a regional ally, and of course to maintain its influence in the region. It is, that's an open secret that this is the case. Now, in the same token, it is also paramount for the Iranian involvement in any solution to the Syrian conflict. And this is where I want to emphasize that point, maybe throughout this program.
Okay. So Iran wants Assad to remain in charge. We saw the Secretary of State over the weekend sort of dropping his guard for a moment and conceding that the United States recognizes that Assad is still in power in Syria, even as it prosecutes the war against ISIL. The French Foreign Minister, Manuel Valls, said over the weekend that that was a big mistake, that conceding that Assad remains in power is absolutely antithetical to bringing peace to the region.
We spoke with the Department of State over the weekend. The Department of State, as you mentioned, issued a statement clarifying the statement of Secretary Kiyaei. We do not believe that Secretary Kiyaei exactly meant what he said. The Syrian opposition is committed to transition talks with members of the Assad regime. They did go to Geneva in early 2014 to negotiate a solution and try and hasten the end of this bloody conflict that's engulfing Syria. And the Assad regime did not engage in Geneva in good faith. So Secretary Kiyaei has called Assad a magnet of terror. But we do recognize that there needs to be a managed transition in Syria. We do recognize there needs to be...
But you heard Emad a moment ago. Iran's not going anywhere, yes, and neither is Assad.
But guess what? That's not the only thing I know about Secretary Kiyaei. I know exactly where he stands, and it's not like I'm going to define him by that statement. We know where he, we know what his thinking is. We know about his conversations with us. We know about his conversations with regional allies. We know about his diplomacy, and we know that he's an ally within the administration. So, by necessity, like the Department of State said, there needs to be negotiations with members of the regime, and the Syrian opposition is committed to that. But these negotiations will only be about a political transition. Assad is not someone who can reunite all Syrians, and so long as Assad stays in power, Syria will continue to be engulfed in chaos.
Emad, this sounds like a recipe for stasis, if nobody gives in.
No, actually, this is the problem. I mean, every solution that has come up by the international community to tackle the Syrian conflict has had one major player absent from those talks. In Switzerland, on 2 occasions, Iran was not there. I mean, how can you even reach a political settlement in Syria without having every party to the conflict involved? And this is why I believe in the future, if there is any political solution, you need the Iranians on that table to bring about some weight to these negotiations and a political process by possibly pressing Assad to make concessions. But that will not happen if Iran is not at the table.
By the way, Iran was invited to the Geneva talks, but Iran was asked to endorse the Geneva communique. That is the main document that has been endorsed internationally for political transition in Syria, and Iran said no. And Iran continues to say that Assad needs to stay in power. So the reason why Iran was not included, Iran was invited, and Iran was not included in the talks because it refused to recognize the Geneva communique. It refused to recognize the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people.
It's time for another quick break on Inside Story. For months I've been asking, how does this end? When the smoke clears in Syria, is Assad still in power? Is Syria still a single state with a single capital? Is there a Kurdistan carved out of Iraq? Do the enemies who have made common cause over fighting the Islamic State retreat to neutral corners after that threat is turned back? Or do they go after each other? Good answers have been in short supply. I'll try again after the break. Still ahead on Inside Story.
Have Have you written a book and want it published? Page Publishing cuts through the confusion of copyright protection, barcodes, and digital rights. We print and digitize your book and place your book for sale online and in bookstores everywhere. Most publishers won't even look at new author submissions. We're different. If we decide to publish your book, your work ends and ours begins. From editing to cover design, we get you published.
Call for your free author submission kit at 1-800-229-1097.
The new Al Jazeera America Primetime. Get the real news you've been looking for.
Everybody in this country can hear that.
At 7, a thorough wrap-up of the day's events.
At the end of the day, we're going to give you an intelligent, context-driven take on the day's news.
Then at 8, John Siegenthaler digs deeper into the stories of the day.
This is a complicated situation. How significant?
And at 9, get a global perspective on the news.
They're sending their government a message. Organizing themselves. People say they're finally fed up.
Weeknights on Al Jazeera America. Primetime. Al Jazeera America. International news.
People here are worried that this already serious situation may escalate.
Shining a light on the untold stories.
Believe in yourself and you might get there.
Making the connections to the bigger picture.
Shouldn't you have been tougher?
Feeling the real impact.
Separatists took control a few days ago.
Get closer to every story.
How easy is it for a fighter to get in?
Get the international news you need to know. Al Jazeera America.
You're watching Inside Story from Al Jazeera America. I'm Ray Suarez. We've been looking at the deepening humanitarian crisis in Syria and the strange bedfellows created by the rise of ISIL in both Syria and next-door Iraq. When the smoke clears and a destroyed, destitute, and depopulated Syria tries to re-emerge, who gets what they want in that part of the world? Mohammed Garem and Emad Kiyaei are still with me. Emad, let's talk about Syria after the war. Is it still a unitary state?
I hope so. The disintegration of Syria will not be in anybody's positive sort of ambitions for any country. The destabilization of Syria has already caused so much insecurity in the region, and I believe it should remain a unified country. That's first and foremost.
Mohammed, I want you to look at satellite pictures recently taken by the group With Syria. Just put out 2 satellite images of Syria by night that show what happened in the last 4 years. The first image is from March 2011. We've labeled the city of Aleppo, one of the largest in Syria. Here's what it looked like in February of 2015. With Syria says 97% of the lights are out in Aleppo, 83% in the whole country since the civil war began.
And guess who's trying to place a siege on Aleppo? Guess who's trying to place a siege on 400,000 civilians in the city of Aleppo? It's Iran and Hezbollah. They recently made a concerted effort to take over the city. Fortunately, they were repelled. They were pushed back, but I'm sure that they will try again. So that is why I would like to go to the point that your guest brought up. If Iran would like to be part of the solution, by all means, but for that to happen, they need to stop aiding and abetting the Assad regime. They need to remove their troops from Syria. They need to make sure they need to remove Hezbollah from Syria. And then maybe if they're interested in engaging in diplomatic talks in good faith, I'm sure that there could be a chance for that. But so far, that has not changed. They have not changed their behavior. They continue day in, day out to slaughter civilians in Syria.
Emad Kiyaei, how about that? That Iran could bring that timeline shorter by stopping active participation in the war on the ground in Syria.
Mohammed is well aware that this conflict has multiple players and everybody has a role and responsibility in it. The Turkish corridor that provided the weapons and ammunition to the opposition, the Saudi and GCC money that supplied and has now created the monster of ISIL or ISIS. I mean, the U.S. cover for this continuation of funds and weaponry to go to the opposition that today has now created this mess in Syria and in the region. Iran cannot step back and say that we're just going to hands off this region and this country. The problem is that the conflict requires first and foremost responsibility, and the Iranians have said over and over again that there needs to be a political solution for this conflict.
Let me jump in there, Emad, because I want Mohammed to respond, because Emad points out that there are now a lot of players, and you heard young Egeland at the beginning of the program talking about 2,000 armed militias with names and identities and sources of funds.
Okay, there are lots of militias in Syria, okay, but guess what? The overwhelming majority of them are Syrians. I'm not talking about ISIS. Unfortunately, the rise of ISIS, ISIS emerged in 2013. But before that, the Syrian opposition was making steady advances. The Assad regime had lost control of over 50% of Syria. And it was the Syrian opposition, it was locals, against the regime. It was only when Iran inserted Hezbollah formally into the conflict in May of 2013 that the tide against the Syrian opposition changed. So your guest is talking about Turkey trying to help the Syrian opposition.
But hasn't Turkey been a protagonist, a player?
Hang on just one second. You're talking about Turkey trying to help the Syrian opposition, or other countries trying to help the Syrian opposition. It is the Syrian opposition. These are the locals. These are the townspeople. These are the people who own their cities and own their neighborhoods. And they rose up against the dictatorship. They do not want to be ruled by Assad. What kind of business does Iran have in Syria to say, you know what? You're the locals, and you're this guy from Aleppo, but you're not entitled to decide which president you should have. We're the ones who are going to decide.
Let me give Emad a chance to respond. What business, you noted an alliance earlier, but what business does Iran have as a combatant in this?
I mean, Ray, we have very little time. I want to give a solution to this issue. Okay. First and foremost, I believe that the breakthrough between US and Iran in P5+1 nuclear talks opens up Iran to come into the region as a more constructive player, one. Number two, there is only a political solution. Number three, no preconditions set by the opposition, Assad government, international community should be on the table when there's a humanitarian crisis. They need to start this political discussion now.
Do you agree on that much?
Everybody involved.
Well, but you're saying there's only a political solution. Sorry, go ahead.
And finally, we need to address the humanitarian crisis through localized ceasefires, through humanitarian corridor. And again, for that to be achieved, we need everybody on board.
If we could have solved this crisis in the confines of a half-an-hour discussion, the war wouldn't be entering its 5th year. I want to thank you both for joining me, Emad Kiyaei and Mohammed Ghanem.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Get in touch on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch us next time in Washington. I'm Ray Suarez.